All right. Good morning. I'm Katie Akins with Arizona Farm Bureau Ag in the Classroom.
Chelsea McGuire, Government Relations Director at the Arizona Farm Bureau. Welcome back to Ag Issues presentation.
Ag Issues 2022. I can't believe it's October already.
Yes.
But it has been a busy year so far. And Chelsea, grateful that you taking some time this morning to get us back into the scheme of things, especially with this month's topic, which is water.
What a surprise.
I feel like we're always talking about water in the desert.
Yep.
And we did last season do an ag issues on water, but I know that we actually have had some floodgates open and some changes happening. Well, we wish floodgates.
We wish,
open.
right? It's more like they opened and nothing came out.
We did get a lot of water this weekend. Yep. How much did you guys get out by you?
You know, we were out of town, so I didn't get a good note. But if the all of the retention basins by my house are any indication, it was a lot.
Yeah, I know that Buckeye area got in some areas 3 inches.
Yeah,
we got 1.25 inches out in Queen Creek.
Oh.
So, and that just happened Saturday and Sunday. So hopefully that's some good news with filling up some of the things. But I guess we'll hear the good or bad news from you.
Well, we'll always take it, right? And so I'm actually going to stop sharing real quick just to make sure we do have the right screen up on sharing. All right, much better, I think, if we do it that way. But yeah, so Katie's right. There's been a lot of updates since the last time that we talked. And honestly, some of them are going to be updates that there's some updates I'm not going to cover is what I'm trying to say here, because there's been so much of it. We're going to focus pretty myopically today on Colorado River Basin, because I think that's what you'll have heard in the news in terms of if you're just paying attention to headlines or paying attention to what people are saying. So I want to give you some background on that and really show, okay, this is what we're talking about. This is why it's in the news, so that you can sort of approach that from a little bit more of an informed place.
Right on.
Right. Okay.
I like it.
So what is happening? What are we going to do? I'm going to, like I said, this is a Colorado River status update, but I always like to sort of lay the foundation for that conversation as well. So we're going to talk about what we actually get from the river. So why we care, why are we getting less? What put us in the situation that we're in? Just how much less are we getting? How bad is it? And then sort of what are our action items from here, and what are, other than just talking about it, you know, what is it that we can actually do? So this may look familiar to some of you because we have talked about it before, but this is the Colorado River Basin. So you can see the states that it impacts. Don't forget, California is little one over there in the corner. They have a much more outsized impact than you would think. You'll see that in the discussions. And then don't forget too, that basin goes into Mexico. So Colorado River flows into the Gulf of California. Mexico is part of that basin too. This is not going to really touch on what the upper basin has or what they get, but we'll talk about lower basin because that's where we are. You can see the upper basin has kind of the black outline. Lower basin doesn't have that. California gets 4.4 million acre feet from the Colorado River. And we've talked about this before, but just so you can visualize it, an acre foot is the amount of water you need to cover an acre with a foot of water. So imagine a football field covered in 1 foot of water. That's how much we're talking about. So 4.4 million of those is a whole lot. It's a technical term.
It's a whole lot. Yeah, it's a whole lot.
Yeah. Arizona receives 2.8 million acre feet of water from the Colorado River. And then Nevada, good old Nevada, gets about 300,000 acre feet. So not a lot, but definitely still significant in times like this. So of that 2.8 that Arizona receives, there's split up between the river, the users that are on the river and the users that are off the river. Now, Katie, how can a person use water from a river if they're not actually on that river?
Well, it gets taken through the canal system.
That's right. It gets taken through the CAP canal. And so that's the kind of the difference that we're talking about, right? On-river users don't have to take it from the canal because they're there. That's our Yuma farmers. That's a lot of tribal users, including the Colorado River Indian tribe or the Crit tribe, appropriately named, right? Agriculture and municipal users happen on those tribal reservations. But really for our purposes, the biggest conversation we'll have, right, is about Yuma farmers. Now, because they're on the river and because of the way our priority system works, those on-river users have a much higher priority to this water. So that means that when there's less of it, they get to continue using that water. It's a first come, first served situation. They were the first ones to use it, so they have the higher priority. The off-river users who get that water from the canal are folks like our Pinal County farmers, tribal communities in the central part of the state, like the Gila River Indian community, and then of course, municipal industrial users like the city of Phoenix, for example, the city of Tucson, all of the suburbs of Phoenix, all of that river water really goes to water to those uses so that they're not relying on the alternative, which would be groundwater. So it's really important, okay? So that's kind of how we use it. And again, I like to give us that sort of framework for it. And before we use this water from the Colorado River, it all gets stored in our major reservoir of Lake Mead. That is where Hoover Dam is. So that's kind of the easy way to remember, you know, Hoover Dam is where all of our water stops before it comes to us. And this is because it's our reservoir, it's kind of it's our guidepost, right? It's our thermometer for how well is the river doing and just how much water is in the river. And if you're looking at this picture, it's pretty obvious.
It's a pretty picture, but it's sad.
Yeah, right. It's not doing all that well because the reason those rocks are two different colors is because the white parts of the rock used to be covered in water and now they're not. The reservoir is not doing too well. There's not quite as much water. There's definitely not as much water in that lake as there used to be. So one of the temptations that I think we see from that fact that there's not as much water left in the river is to just say it's because we're using too much. Objectively, that is a true statement, right? We are using more water than the river is providing. But to just say it's because we're using too much, I think sort of discounts the fact that there are a lot of factors really kind of outside of our control that impact how much water the river gives us, right? It's not like we're just saying we're taking everything that can come down. We have that allocation. We've been given that 2.8 million acre feet. We don't use more than that. The problem is that 2.8 million acre feet plus the 4.4 that California gets, plus 300,000 that Nevada gets, all of those were determined based on average flows of the river in the early 1900s, like that 1920s period, okay? And if you look at this chart and you just sort of, you know, like let your eyes blur a little bit, you sort of see those blue lines of how much flow is in the river. They're a little higher on that side of the chart than they are anywhere else. And it turns out that those years we were using as averages on the Colorado were historically wet years. So we were starting with an overly optimistic view of how much water that river could actually produce in the first place. Then we've got not just that, you know, on average, the river flows less. We're in the midst of decades-long drought. And so not only do we have less than the average, we have less than healthy, right? We have way less than average. And snowpack doesn't have as much impact because when it does rain or when it does snow, our ground everywhere is just so dry that instead of flowing into the river, that water gets soaked into the ground. It's like a dry sponge, right? So I'm not saying this in order to just say, you know, we should keep using as much as we're using. No. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is don't blame water use on the fact that there is less water in the river. I think that our water use and the way we allocated the river was responsible based on the best information that we had in 1920, right? Now it's 2022. We are 100 years removed from that and we have better information, but we have economies and we have states and we have industries that have built up based on the not so good information. So what do we do with that? That's the situation that we're in. And I think that makes it a whole lot more complicated than if it were just a simple fact of we were irresponsible and we used too much. No, that's really not what we're doing here. We're trying to figure out how do we do this and how do we live with the reality, but also live within the reality of the economy that we've created. And that's really not easy. So one of the ways that we tried to do that was through DCP. If you have followed any of these Ag Issues webinars in the past, you have seen this beautiful little chart before. And so this was for those off-river users, right? We talked about they're the ones that have lower priority. So when there's less water, they lose water first. Knowing that shortages were coming, knowing that we had bad data or overly optimistic data on what the river could do for us back in the 20s, we said, okay, we see what's coming down the pipeline. When Lake Mead reaches certain levels, we're going to cut our water use or our ability to use water amongst these groups. So beginning at this year, we were in a tier 1 shortage. So that means that Lake Mead was below that 1075 level. And tier 1, you see over on that chart where the little T1 is, that's where the cuts were made under DCP. cut out the entire ag pool, which is what Pinal County and Central Arizona Agriculture used from the CAP. We've been dealing with the ramifications of that ever since. If you want to, Google Nancy K. Wood. You'll tell all about it. She has done, I think, 75 interviews this year, and that is not an exaggeration. That's an actual number. So I won't go into too much of that. Back in August, they announced that we will be in a tier 2 shortage going into 2023. So you see now we're really starting to dip into that second layer priority. It's called the non-Indian ag priority, which is a little bit misleading because most of that water actually is tribal water at this point, given some different agreements that have been made over the years. But so we're starting to see those off-river users getting squeezed even more. Okay. But then,
Always the but.
and that wasn't even a but on something good, right? It was like, here's a bad thing that's happening, but there's even more. So, we talked about the fact that the situation that we're in is because of some things that are really outside of our control in terms of hydrology. And the Bureau of Reclamation, which is the federal government agency that's responsible for managing the river, they're the owners of the dam, right? They are the ones that built the dam, and they deliver the water. They said, okay, DCP was great, guys, and we really appreciate what the lower basin states are doing in order to keep the river healthy or try to keep the river healthy, but it's nowhere near enough. We need an additional 2 to 4 million acre feet of water conservation. So water we're not going to use, we're going to keep on the system in order to avoid just a crash to the point where we don't have enough water in Lake Mead to run the dam to create electricity. We don't have enough water to deliver 2 to 4 million acre feet is what it's going to take in order to make that happen.
Wait, but in Arizona, aren't we only allotted 2.8 in the first place?
Yeah, they sure are.
So like they're talking about, obviously they're not just taking from Arizona, but essentially taking that amount of water out of use.
So an entire state's allocation of water out of use. And you say they're not just talking about Arizona, but technically, if we're going based on the levels of priority,
we're the little ones.
We are the low priority users on the river. So if they were just to do something that's straight across the board, how we agreed we would do it, that would all fall on Arizona at this point. So that is a really scary thing to think about, right? And that is a catastrophe in the making. But the Bureau recognized, like Katie just said, that's not all going to come. It can't all come from one state. We're not going to let an entire state go dry.
Especially when we are the winter lettuce capital of the world. Where's the lettuce going to come from?
Right? There you go. So the Bureau kind of said, all right, stakeholders, this is what we need. This was in June that they made this announcement. And they said, on the 16th, when we make our announcement about what tier of shortage we're going to be in, by that time, we want you guys to have a plan. Figure out how we're going to keep this water on the river. But then August 16 came and August 16 went. We didn't really hear a whole lot from the Bureau. And that was kind of frustrating because we're in a little bit of a crisis mode here, right? And we're trying to figure out what's going on. But because of that crisis, and this was the perfect lead-in from Katie, we had users in Arizona going, look, we're senior. We're going to have this water because where we are in the priority system, but we've got to do something. We've got to figure out how do we save the river given, what our ability is to do that and how much water can we leave on the river and still have a viable industry because we're the winter lettuce capital of the world. And so Yuma's farmers said, look, we are huge water users and we get that. It's a good thing. We like the fact that we're big water users. We do really good things with that water. But what might we be able to do in order to help accomplish some of those cuts? What's practical? What could we look at? And so they came up with what they called the Save the River Plan. And the easiest way, and the words I think I've said 4,000 times since June, is voluntary compensated reductions in water use. So farmers are voluntarily saying, I'm going to use less water in exchange for compensation from the federal government for the fact that I no longer have that very critical input that I need to use in order to produce the things that we eat and that we rely on. So in Yuma, they said, we have a lot of ability to do that. There's about 125,000 acres in Yuma where we could do that, but where we could really make a difference is if we take that entire kind of lettuce belt in Yuma and in Imperial Valley, California. So if we can do that, we can put about 900,000 acres together. That's a lot of acres.
That's a lot.
And that means it's a lot of water. And for about $1,500, we think that we could afford to give up 1 acre foot of water per acre, because that $1,500 would allow us to invest in additional water conservation technology. That $1,500 would allow us to take some of our marginal land out of production and make sure we're focusing on land that does really, really well. It is very, very productive and high yielding. And if you give us 4 years of that, then we have some time to sort of adjust our systems and figure out where we're going. And yeah, we can make that work. And that would mean almost 1 million acre feet of water
Back in the river.
Over 4 years. That's a good thing,
That's good.
right? We really like that. But Katie, do a little quick math. Let's just call it 1 million acres to make it easy. And
It's Monday.
$1,500 per acre over 1 million acres.
It's a lot of money.
We're
talking
a
like
lot.
billions.
It's that same technical term of a lot. We're talking billions.
We're talking billions.
Yes, especially over 4 years. So where is that money going to come from?
We just print it.
Yeah. I mean, basically. So we don't, as a government, have that kind of money, or anybody, right? Doesn't just sort of have that sort of money sitting around. So when we started hearing conversations at the federal level about the Inflation Reduction Act, saying, okay, what are we going to do and what kinds of investments are we going to make in our economy to help combat some of the inflation that we're seeing, we jumped on that and we said, hey, if you don't want food prices to go up for inflation, we probably still need to have the ability to produce food, because if we constrict that supply, the price is going to continue to go up. So maybe one of the good ways to combat inflation and high food prices is to protect agricultural production. Very logical argument, in my opinion. And we were successful. We were able to work with Senator Sinema and Senator Kelly in securing $4 billion in that Inflation Reduction Act for the purpose of Western drought mitigation. Now, it is not just Western drought mitigation for the Save the River plan. Because remember what I said, the Bureau has not come out and said, that's our plan, that's what we're going to do, that sounds great. And we're not the only state dealing with drought. There were a bunch of states in that Colorado River Basin, right? There's only 3 in the lower basin. There are 4 more in the upper basin. Everybody's looking for a way to reduce water and to get some compensation for that. So the $4 billion is for drought in all of the states where the Bureau of Reclamation works. That's not every state in the nation. They're just really what we would call the Western states. And there are 3 different ways that this money can be used. The first is voluntary compensated reductions in water use. Exactly what we write something. Save the river is just the easiest way to say it. But we'll get to sort of what we think that's actually going to look like practically, right? And then the second is this sort of voluntary system conservation. That's more long-term type stuff, right? Where we're talking system conservation is much more lining canals. And so that's going to save water over the long term. It's a reservoir construction or dam repair, that sort of thing. So, and specifically it says, for environmental benefits. So that's not necessarily system conservation so that we can use more of that water, but it is to leave that water on the system. And then the third is more environmentally focused as well, with ecosystem and habitat restoration, because those things are degrading because you have a reservoir or something that doesn't have water in it anymore. If you know what the Salton Sea is in California, that's what this paragraph is about. Okay. It's trying to fix the Salton Sea, which is a massive disaster right now. Do I think that that is the best way to use this money based on the more immediate need? No, there are a lot of people that disagree with me, but that's kind of what this money was for, right? And great, that's wonderful. We have $4 billion.
The fight begins. The fight begins.
The fight begins, but even before the fight, you got to remember, we gave $4 billion to an agency, and we said to this agency, go give this money out for these 3 purposes. And they said, okay, we don't really know how to do that. And in their defense, they really don't. That's not what the Bureau was created to do. They weren't created to be sort of a bank or a grant system program, right? They're just going, we don't know what to do here. So that act was passed, oh goodness, back in August. We talked with the Bureau about it in September when we went out for our DC trip. And then finally, 2 weeks ago, we had a listening session from the Bureau where they said, okay, we have a 2-tiered program that we're going to use here. last week we got sort of a more detailed letter that talked about what they want to see in terms of applications for this money. Their voluntary compensated reductions in water use are looking at about $300 to $400 an acre foot. That's not 15, right? That's not $1,500 an acre foot. So what that means is that there's a whole lot less incentive now for farms to participate in that kind of program, because they just really can't make that pencil out. They've got contracts that they need to fulfill. They have a business that they need to run it. And that number may not get the kind of participation that we could see to get that million acre feet back on the river. But it means there, and there will definitely be some folks who take advantage of it. So that's a good thing. Kind of the second tier, so that's more the short term, right? That's the Band-Aid. The second tier is the longer fix of the actual symptoms. So that's those durable projects like we talked about, lining canals, water recycling projects, additional infrastructure to deliver water more effectively or retain and store more water. Rotational fallowing is also a bullet point that was on the list under that durable long-term project. I think that I would like to see that more on the short term, right? We don't want to cripple the industry that we are in fact trying to protect by keeping water to it, but there's a debate that can go either way on that. So again, happy to see this, real glad. But does that tell me really a lot about, can I help my members go out and apply for that money now? I sort of just feel like Elmo still, or maybe the Bureau feels like Elmo, where it's just like we're trying and maybe we can. So at least we have some direction now. So it's a little bit less of an Elmo shrug at this juncture. But I think that one of the reasons I get so frustrated or so worried about how little information we have is that all of that I just lined out, where it's like, here's $4 billion and here's some of the stuff we're going to do with it, to me does not seem strong enough based on the crisis that we're in. It's a lot of money, and I think we could be making some really good strides with it. I think these will be some good strides, but it's going to take a whole lot more than that. And it's going to take a lot of leadership that we don't necessarily have right now, a lot of unity within the state that we don't necessarily have right now. And the less of that we have, the more of a target gets put on agriculture's back. Because let's be honest, we're the largest water user, right? And that means that if you're sort of looking at it from an efficiency standpoint, that's probably the user you're going to look at to say, you're going to be the ones that can sacrifice the most water. And one of the fears that I have as we talk about that is this alfalfa thing, because this is the question that I've had to answer for quite some time. I bet you are, horse owner.
$25 a bale. I used to pay $5.25.
I don't even want to tell them what I used to pay for a bag of steer show feed. I would complain about what I was paying for a bag of steer show feed when it was $8 a bag.
Yeah.
So what I hear all the time is, why are we growing alfalfa in the desert? We could save so much water if you would just switch to a less water intensive crop.
Dairies?
Objectively, it is a true statement, right? If we stopped growing alfalfa, we would use less water. But I'm going to get on a soapbox for the next 4 slides. Thank you, Katie. I've just been given permission, because there's a real short-sighted view of what beneficial use of water means, if that is your talking point, right? But let's look at it. Let's take this view of alfalfa. We know, because we are in the industry, but we'll remind you all, if you're not, alfalfa is something that cows eat. It is a high-protein forage crop, very good for ruminant digestion, and it's grown commercially really heavily across our state, especially in sort of central Arizona counties, but also some in Yuma as well, and every county has some alfalfa. And it's pretty water intensive. This is going to depend on who you ask. I used to have like one number on the slide, and I have since adjusted that number. But it's going to require kind of on the higher end, around 6 acre feet of irrigation. So talked about that football field. Imagine that football field covered in 6 feet of water. That's how much your successful alfalfa crop is going to take to grow.
Over the season.
Correct. Not all at once. Don't do that. So I think it's a fair question of, why are we using that much water on a crop when we are in the middle of a water crisis? I think there are 3 reasons that we're doing that. The first is that alfalfa is actually a unique ecological benefit of a crop. There are things that alfalfa does because of the way you irrigate alfalfa and because of the way that it grows that other crops can't do. One, it's a legume, so it fixates nitrogen from the sky, it puts it back in the soil, and it really improves our soil quality. How many of us like haboobs? No, they're terrible, right? And it's partially because we have some real dry, really highly erodible soils here in Arizona. Alfalfa helps that significantly. Also makes it a really great rotation crop for the next thing that you're going to plant because plants need nitrogen. And so you've got a nitrogen-rich soil. It's a great thing for the next thing you're going to grow. But also, I used to have to drive past a whole lot of alfalfa in the Buckeye area to take my daughter to daycare. And irrigation weeks were our favorites because birds were everywhere. And there were flocks of white birds in this one, and then there were little birds in this one. And so we would just be so excited to bird watch on the way to daycare and really sad when they weren't there. But that's because birds will hang out where there's water.
Right.
And so alfalfa creates wildlife habitat, especially for birds, that you cannot replicate anywhere else, especially in the desert, because we don't really have standing water anywhere else. And it goes the same for bugs too. So pollinators, beneficial predators, if we're worried about bees, alfalfa is a great crop for bees because it has flowers and bees can hide in there and they need to pollinate that. And it's a really good thing. So this is a good crop objectively, right?
When I want to go back to your water thing with the birds, because I mean, a lot of people say, oh, well, I see, there's water on all of the crops.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about produce, they use things to mitigate those, keep them away.
Yeah.
Because if you got birds pooping where your crops are in leafy greens, all of a sudden you can't use that product because of food safety.
That's
and
right.
So I think that's a very good point. When it's a place where birds can go to get water because there are so many crops that we have to keep the birds away because of food safety.
That's a really good point.
So,
yeah. And so it's sort of uniquely situated for something like that. Frankly, Katie, for me, the slide is cool and it's exciting, but it doesn't,
I mean, it's not a seller. Yeah,
it's not a great seller, but it's why I open with that.
But
it's like laying foundation, right?
It's the basics that you need to.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So here's selling point number 2. Locally sourced food.
I mean, that is a label that you can charge 4 times more for.
You can charge 4 times more for it, but I think too, it's sort of a legitimate thing that consumers are looking at right now. They want to feel like they know where their food is coming from because that makes them feel safer about their food. It makes them feel better about their food. And without the sort of raw product to create that food, locally sourced food is not possible. Okay. 97% of the milk that you find on Arizona grocery stores, and I did have someone from UDA listen to this presentation and he confirmed that. So I'm happy about that. It came from Arizona dairies. If you don't have alfalfa to feed cattle, you don't have Arizona dairies, right? So that means that milk's going to have to come from somewhere else. And that one has that sort of, we can't call it locally sourced anymore. But 2, let's talk about that from a sustainability standpoint. If it didn't come from here and it came from somewhere else, what are the resources we need to get products from somewhere else to here? It's time, which means there's more food spoilage. It's fossil fuels because you're shipping it on a truck or maybe, on a train or something else from the place where it was produced to here. But it also means that alfalfa had to be grown somewhere else too, right? So we're shifting our use of resources, but at the end of the day, we're actually using more resources if we're bringing our food in from somewhere else. We're bringing it in from somewhere farther away. It also creates an economy in Arizona that's really important. And I keep saying that, so let's stop saying economy and let's just start saying jobs, because we all know what jobs are, right? Yeah. It creates jobs. And dairy manufacturing, when you're taking that raw milk and turning it into yogurt or cheese, or you're giving it to Fairlife to create lactose-free milk, like whatever that is, that creates jobs. People have to work at those plants, and then they live in those communities and they buy groceries and they send kids to school and they pay taxes. That's 18% of the manufacturing jobs in Pinal County. Really, really punches kind of above its weight class when it comes to this is what the dairy industry and therefore the alfalfa industry does for our state. And dairy is not the only thing alfalfa supports either, right? We have beef as well, so there's the horse industry.
I was going to say, us equines.
Equines, they matter too. So this is all interconnected. And I think to talk about that too, like my last point, or the thing that really convinces me more, is that if we can't grow it here, we have to grow it somewhere else. We have to bring it in from there. Do they grow it well in those other places?
And we have no say.
And not only, no say in the quality, but just objectively, Arizona alfalfa yields are close to 8.5 tons per acre on average. Nationwide, 3.2. So if we have to replicate the alfalfa production that we have here in Arizona somewhere else where there's water, maybe that resource concern is mitigated. But what about all the other resource concerns? Because we're going to need more than twice the land, which means we are going to need more than twice the tillage of that land, whatever that looks like. It may mean that we need more chemical product on twice the land because there are more pests on twice the land. It may not be the same quality, so we may not be getting the same bang for our buck once that animal actually consumes that alfalfa, right? The word sustainability has to consider more than just water. And we are using water to grow alfalfa because that's a really good, really effective use of water. Where if we were to use that water to grow alfalfa somewhere else, we would not be getting the same amount of that crop. So you really, I think, have to look at this from the perspective of a phrase that I've been trying to just nail into the heads of everybody I meet. Water use is not water waste.
Yeah,
okay?
I've heard that once or twice.
A couple times, right,
Once or
Katie?
twice.
They're sick of me. It's okay. We're using that water really effectively. So as we're talking about the Colorado River and we're saying we've got to find ways to use water better and we've got to find ways to use less water, that doesn't just mean that we look at something that uses a lot of water and we stop doing that. We have to figure out what the value proposition is for that thing and then determine how can we maintain that value proposition with less of that resource. And that's why the conversation is so hard.
Can I bring you back to the alfalfa? Because I can already tell people are screaming behind the screen with the question, why is it, what makes Arizona so special to be able to do 8.5 ton per acre where everybody else is 3.2 ton per acre? What are the components? I mean, I know.
Katie knows, and
share.
I would definitely too, if you are interested in doing a much deeper dive on this, the University of Arizona has some really, really cool statistics on this, and we can probably find some links and show them and send them over to you. But there's really two reasons. It's sunlight and it's soil. Alfalfa likes hot climates. It likes dry climates. Humidity is not the best thing for alfalfa. And so if you are in a place like Arizona where you can grow alfalfa in a dry area and then bring the water to it, it thrives there. But we also have sunlight all year round, which means we can grow more and more cuttings, right? We can grow that alfalfa, cut it, and then let it grow again and cut it. So we can just do that more times than other places in the nation can do that. And that's why we make so much of it here. It likes our soil. It likes our dry climate. It's just, this is a good place to grow this particular plant. I'm not a biologist, in case you could not tell.
No, that's really good. It all comes down to climate.
It does. All of it. That wonderful fifth sea.
That's right.
We love so much. So Katie, that's what I have. Notice I didn't give a whole lot of great solutions this time around. You know, we're still having those discussions.
Figuring it out.
Yeah, figuring it out. But what I will say, you know, with an election coming up, resources for these kinds of discussions or resources for these kinds of projects are going to be more important than ever. And so what we want to see are politicians that are dedicated to allocating those resources without handicapping industries in ways that would really not make sense for efficiency or biological diversity, like handicapping alfalfa, for example. So
when I loved how you talked about, you know, Save the River with Yuma and sort of the Yuma ag industry came together and tried to work on a solution. Like, how can we play a role in this, even though we're not going to be the first ones to lose, right? Because they are a higher priority. But what is sort of the overall feel throughout the state with our farmers and ranchers with water? Is there this sort of impending doom? Are people just going on with business as usual? You know, I mean, I know what happened in Pinal County and how that hit people. And a lot of consumers had just no idea. Right. I mean, they're just, all of a sudden people would see me and they're like, Pinal County, our farmers don't have water. What's going on? You know, and it was like this, some new thing to them. So kind of what is that mindset of our farmer in Arizona right now?
I would say that after the June announcement, nothing has been business as usual. Since then, it definitely lit the fire, especially in Yuma. Like you said, water users who have always been very efficient, but weren't necessarily the ones coming to the table saying, hey, here's what we can do to leave a bunch of water on the river. It has been in just a huge climate of uncertainty. And so the fact that the Bureau is, taking this long to figure out what these projects are going to look like is not helping that level of uncertainty. So it's a business trying to make a business decision about what inputs they have.
Contract and they
exactly like they're in the thick of produce season right now, or about to be in the thick of produce season, and they're going to have contracts for the next produce season coming up. And so it's a lot of uncertainty, which has led to a lot of who can we talk to? What is the action plan, and not having a lot of like concrete action items to do. So I think that getting some of this money from the Bureau on the ground will be helpful. And once we sort of start to see the kinds of projects they want to prioritize, we can start again, banding together, keeping together, I guess I should say, especially with the Yuma folks, those groups of coalitions that are saying this is what we can do. How can we facilitate that project? That's what I want to see. I want to see at least some knowledge of what are the resources we're going to have to work with, and how do we transition what our production is going to look like over the next 6 months, 9 months, based on that knowledge. But we can't do it without the Bureau's help.
Never a good place to be.
No.
Never a good place to be.
So,
well, I think this was a great sort of update on water and where we are. And, I feel like we can't leave this conversation without also wrapping into it a little bit, the importance of, as we talk about water, the continued discussion about science and agriculture.
Yeah.
And you know where I'm going, because I know water use is not water waste is your tagline, and everybody knows when Katie walks in, it's all about biotechnology, right? And seed genetics, and that's going to be huge as we move into the future, is people understanding from a consumer standpoint, understanding these technologies and how they're being used, because the need for these drought resistant crops, so we can continue to get high yields using less, is a big piece as well. It's not going to solve the water problem, but it might be able to help a little bit through it too. So
yeah, and I think just generally too, right? What are the practices in agriculture that make us as efficient as possible? And are we as a consumer base, and are we as a regulatory base facilitating and empowering those practices?
Right.
We need to be.
Yeah. And I think that's, I hear a lot of times when I'm out in the schools and in the community that, well, why are you using flood? That's not the most efficient. Why isn't everybody using drip? And I think there's a lot more that people need to recognize to that piece. But as you're talking regulatory, the expense to be able to transition into that.
And then it just doesn't work well everywhere either.
No, and not with all crops.
Yeah. So there needs to be those resources and that flexibility for individual farmers and practitioners to know what's best to be able to make those decisions.
Yeah. So it's no easy answer, but I'm glad that we're having the discussion, and we'll definitely, when we post this video on the website, put a bunch of links, especially to the Nancy Kaywood interviews, to the U of A resources, specifically on alfalfa, so you can understand that crop here in the state a little bit more, and its impact here in the state as well. And it's a forever ongoing topic, so we'll keep adding those links, and I'm sure we'll be having this again. I'm sure we'll be talking water again. As usual, if you have any questions, reach out, Katie Akins at azfb.org. I'm really just going to forward them on to Chelsea, let's be honest, so let's go with the Chelsea McGuire at azfb.org. But I will have that on the web as well. So make sure you visit us at azfbaitc.org. See you next time.
Bye, guys.